A tiny phone company just put Windows 11 on trial, and Windows lost on its own hardware. That is not hype. That is what happened when Next Computer announced the Next Phone, a phone that runs Android, Debian, Linux, and Windows 11 on the exact same chip, switching between them depending on what you plug it into. 3 operating systems, 1 device, no excuses. The Linux side booted clean and ran a real desktop. The Windows side needed a costume just to function, and it still could not make a phone call. Windows mode on this phone has no cellular connectivity at all. On a phone, that alone would be enough to make headlines. But that is only the beginning, because the deeper you look into why this device exists, the worse Microsoft and Google both start to look. This is not a fantasy where Linux outsells the iPhone. Nobody serious is claiming that. What is actually happening is smaller and arguably more damaging to Microsoft, because it is a side-by-side comparison that a small hardware company basically backed into. Next Computer is the team behind the Next Dock, those laptop shells you plug a phone into to fake a real computer. They have been chasing the dream of phone as PC for over a decade, and with the Next Phone, they finally built a version close enough to actually test. It ships with Android 16 as the default operating system. No bloatware, nothing fighting for your attention out of the box. Plug it into a monitor with a USB-C cable, and you can switch into a full Android desktop or launch Debian Linux as an app with GPU acceleration. Want Windows instead? You can boot into that too, right on the device. 3 computers, 1 phone, 1 price tag of $549, with a refundable deposit if you want to reserve one, ahead of the planned Q3 2026 launch. Here is the detail that makes this story matter. The chip powering all of this, Qualcomm's QCM6490, is not a flagship phone processor. It is an enterprise-grade chip built for IoT hardware, the kind of part that ends up in industrial scanners and rugged tablets. Qualcomm backs it with long-term support through 2036. A budget chip aimed at warehouses just got promised a decade of support, while millions of perfectly working Windows PCs got told their hardware was not good enough to keep receiving updates. A tiny company solved long-term support using spare parts. Microsoft solved it by telling people to buy new computers. But the real humiliation is what happens when Windows actually boots on this thing. Next had to build an entirely custom interface just to make Windows 11 tolerable on a phone screen. A grid-based skin that looks more like old Windows phone tiles than modern Windows, because the real Windows desktop simply does not work at that size. So a third party had to redesign Microsoft's own operating system to make it usable on hardware Microsoft never bothered to support properly in the first place. And then there is the part that should genuinely worry Microsoft. Boot into Windows mode on the Next Phone, and you lose cellular connectivity completely. No calls over the carrier network, no texts. You can fall back to Wi-Fi apps like WhatsApp, but even that comes with a headache, since WhatsApp logs connected devices out after 2 weeks of inactivity, meaning you might need a second phone just to keep Windows mode usable at all. Windows 11 on ARM also still leans heavily on emulation for everyday software, which costs you performance and battery life. This is the part users hate. You paid for a phone. Windows mode turns it into a laptop that cannot call anyone. That is the humiliation. And Microsoft did not even build the phone that exposed it. Here is why this matters beyond one strange gadget. This is happening at the exact moment Windows 11 is already in crisis on regular laptops and desktops everywhere. Earlier this year, Microsoft's own Windows lead, Pavan Davuluri, publicly admitted that Windows 11 went off track. His words, after years of piling on AI features while basic stability kept slipping. That is not a Reddit complaint. That is the person running Windows admitting the operating system lost the plot. And the timing backs him up. January's first Windows 11 update of the year spiraled into a genuine mess, with emergency patches needed for shutdown failures and crashes inside cloud apps like OneDrive and Dropbox. A second emergency patch followed days later, because the first one was not enough. A separate security update quietly disabled legacy modem drivers on older hardware, and Microsoft confirmed reports of blue screens and boot failures tied to a January security patch. Imagine installing a mandatory update and watching your computer refuse to boot afterward. That is documented, not a hypothetical. This is exactly why people are fed up. Updates used to fix things. Now they are a gamble. The privacy and control side goes even deeper, and this is where Microsoft made the wrong bet again and again. Take the Copilot key, the dedicated button Microsoft started forcing onto new keyboards. Microsoft's own support documentation admits the key caused disruption to productivity and accessibility workflows for some users. That is an admission, in writing. And what did Microsoft do about it? Not remove the key. New PCs still ship with it. The only concession is letting you remap what it does. Microsoft built a problem, admitted the problem, and then asked users to work around it themselves. It gets worse. Mozilla, the company behind Firefox, has publicly accused Microsoft of auto-installing the M365 Copilot app onto people's machines without ever asking for consent. Mozilla also documented dark patterns baked into Windows, like the taskbar search bar being hard-coded to open Microsoft Edge no matter what browser you have set as default, and apps like Outlook and Teams, ignoring your default browser settings entirely to force links open in Edge anyway. Microsoft also excluded the European Economic Area from the automatic Copilot install. Not because it suddenly respected user choice everywhere else. Because EU regulators would have made it expensive not to. That does not prove intent, but it shows where Microsoft draws its lines, and it is not around what users want, it is around what regulators force. And here is the pattern that should worry you the most. Microsoft already paused forced Copilot installs once, after backlash and after a bug that let the Copilot app access confidential emails. That is a real security failure, not speculation. Then, once the dust settled, Microsoft quietly reinstated the forced installation, with a full rollout to all Microsoft 365 users reportedly targeted for completion by July 1st of this year. Microsoft apologized, then did it again. That is not a fix, that is a pattern. Now here is why this story is not just about Microsoft. While Windows users were fighting forced AI, Android was quietly tightening its own grip in a different direction. Google is rolling out a new Android developer verification program that requires every developer, even ones who never touch the Play Store, to register centrally with Google before their apps can run on certified Android devices. Verification opened to all developers earlier this year, with enforcement beginning on certified devices in countries like Brazil, Indonesia, Thailand, and Singapore later this year, and a global rollout planned after that. A coalition calling itself Keep Android Open, backed by more than 36 organizations, including the Electronic Frontier Foundation and F-Droid, says this effectively ends Android as an open platform. That is their characterization, not a settled fact, but it shows how seriously privacy advocates are taking it. And Android's trust problems do not stop there. Google was hit with a jury verdict worth roughly $425 million for continuing to collect activity data through third-party app code, even after users had specifically opted out, covering close to 98 million people. Google is appealing, so that verdict is not final. But the allegation itself, that an opt-out toggle did not actually opt you out, is exactly the kind of story that makes people stop trusting defaults. A separate settlement, worth around $135 million, addressed Android phones quietly using background cellular data to send information to Google without permission. Bloatware complaints have not gone anywhere either. Look at Nothing, called out for not letting users uninstall pre-installed Meta apps before rolling that restriction back once backlash got loud enough. This is why destroys Windows and Android lands as a headline. It is not because Linux is winning. It is because both companies are running the same playbook at once. Tighten control, wait for backlash, walk it back just enough to survive the headlines, then quietly keep going. So where does Linux actually fit into this? Honestly, not as a conquering hero. As the only one of the 3 operating systems on the next phone that did not need an excuse. The Debian side runs clean, with GPU acceleration, no forced account, no Copilot key, no ad sitting in your start menu, no prompts, no mercy. That is a real contrast worth pointing out. But home users need to be careful here, and this is the part where I am not going to oversell it. Linux phones are still a niche product. The wider mobile Linux scene, things like the Librem 5, the PinePhone Pro, Fury Labs FLX1, Postmarket OS, Ubuntu Touch, is real and actively maintained. But even privacy-focused reviewers who use these devices daily admit no Linux phone matches an iPhone or a Pixel for reliability yet. Battery life is rough, Calls can be unreliable outside specific carriers in the EU and Canada, and banking apps and mainstream software often just do not exist. The PinePhone Pro does not even have a confirmed sequel because the company decided another dedicated phone was too financially risky, and the mobile Linux community has shifted its energy toward porting Linux onto cheap Android hardware instead. Even the next phone's own Linux side is not flawless. A company demo reportedly showed a basic system utility crashing on stage. This is powerful technology, but it is not something a casual user should expect to just work straight out of the box. That is the honest caveat. And it does not undo the bigger point. It just makes the bigger point more believable. And the reaction tells you this is not a story being invented out of nowhere. Multiple major tech outlets independently covered the next phone after seeing it at CES, treating a triple boot phone from a niche startup as one of the more interesting devices at the entire show. Survey data from IT research firm Spiceworks shows roughly a third of IT decision-makers have no migration timeline off Windows 10 at all, and close to a fifth are actively evaluating alternatives like Chrome OS or Linux. Mozilla put its criticism of Microsoft's defaults in writing, publicly. Privacy advocates saw the Android verification rollout as a warning sign, and the mobile Linux community keeps shipping updates whether or not anyone outside the niche is watching. That is quiet, documented momentum, not a fringe movement screaming into the void. Zoom out, and the bigger picture gets uncomfortable for Microsoft specifically. Windows 11 reportedly crossed 1 billion active devices faster than Windows 10 ever did, and Microsoft will absolutely point to that number as proof everything is fine. But in that same reporting period, the division covering Windows, Surface, and gaming actually declined year over year. Microsoft is growing and losing trust at the exact same time. That should be impossible. It is not. Reports from earlier this year still put well over half of Windows machines on Windows 10, with people citing legacy app compatibility and hardware that fails the TPM2 requirement as the reason they have not moved. That figure is from earlier reporting, not a live tracker, but the trend behind it has not reversed. So no, a $500 phone from a company best known for laptop shells did not literally destroy Windows or Android. Nobody serious is claiming Windows is dead or that everyone is switching to Linux tomorrow. That is not what happened here. What actually happened is smaller and somehow more damning. A small hardware company had to build 3 operating systems onto one chip just to show people something Microsoft and Google have been avoiding for years, that when you put the alternative right next to the original, it does not need to apologize for anything. Linux did not win this comparison because it is perfect. We just spent the last few minutes proving it is not. It won because, on this one device, it was the only operating system that did not need an excuse, a workaround, or a forced update to explain why it was behaving badly. Microsoft built an operating system so loaded with forced accounts, forced AI, and forced updates that its own engineering lead had to publicly admit it went off track. Google built a platform so tightly controlled that the organizations that helped make Android open in the first place are now fighting to keep it that way. And somewhere in the middle of all that, a phone nobody expected put both of them on the same screen as a community-built alternative and let users watch the comparison happen in real time. So here is the real question, and it is worth sitting with. If a tiny startup running a warehouse-grade chip can make Windows look like the weakest operating system on its own hardware, what does that actually say about what 2 of the biggest companies on Earth have been building for the rest of us? Why does it take a niche device, a refundable deposit, and a community willing to deal with crashing demos and unreliable calls just to get a computer that does not argue with you, track you, or demand an apology update? That is not a rhetorical jab. That is the question Microsoft and Google should be answering right now. And until they do, expect more tiny tools, more side projects, and more accidental comparisons like this one to keep doing the job the giants refuse to do themselves.